Better still. Choctaws always run a little late.
Okay, good. Well, we get on very well then.
That's another reason.
Another reason, right? Absolutely. And so we have people participating on the webinar, but also it will be on YouTube and that too. You know, so there's different ways that people can be part of the event today. You know, so.
Okay.
Great.
Are your walls purple?
Yes, they're a very dark kind of purple. Yeah.
Well, the reason I ask is one of the rooms in my house is exactly that color.
Okay.
And so.
All right. Well, I wish I could claim credit for it, but these were the colors were here when we bought the house 20 years ago. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, it looks good.
Okay. Thank you.
Are you teaching today as well, Leanne, or are you?
No, I teach Thursday.
Okay.
And so I have a very long class on Thursday, and it usually breaks up around 6:30
Okay.
p.m.
That is late.
So, how about you?
Yeah, I'm done. I was on site, so I'm now finished. Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay. Well, it's just after 12:30, so I think I will begin with the introductions. Good afternoon and welcome to UMSL Global at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. My name is Eamon Wall and I'm the Chair of Irish Studies at UMSL Global. Special thanks today to Leanne Constantine, Executive Director of UMSL Global, and to Bob L, Senior Program Coordinator, for making this event possible. Our next event features a veteran and award-winning St. Louis journalist Don Corrigan on Tuesday, November the 9th at 12:30. He will report on his visits to Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Also, a reminder that our study abroad program in Galway resumes in 2022 after a 2-year COVID-19 hiatus. If you need information on this, please let me know or get in touch with us at UMSL Global. Today's event will run for an hour and 15 minutes approximately. The presentation is about 45 minutes and will be followed by Q&A. Please, you can put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read them out to our speakers at the end of it. Our event today brings together two nations, the Choctaw and the Irish. And I think that it is fitting that an enterprise such as ours at UMSL Global, where our mission is to bring nations closer, should host this event. We are celebrating a book and its editors and a great story. The book is the Choctaw-Irish Gift Exchange from the Great Hunger to the present, and the remarkable generosity shown by the Choctaw Nation during the Great Hunger in Ireland, 1845 to 1850 approximately. The book has been widely praised and read by many. And so we are honored today to have both editors with us. Padraig Kerwin is a senior lecturer in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Goldsmiths College, University of London, who has published widely in the fields of Native American literature and also in Irish studies. Leanne Howe, born and raised in Oklahoma, is an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation and Eidson Distinguished Professor of American Literature at the University of Georgia. She is the author of many books, scholarly and creative, for which she has received many awards, including an American Book Award for her novel Shell Shaker and an MLA Prize for Native American Lit. Please welcome Leanne Howe and Padraig Kerwin, who are going to tell you the story of famine pots the Choctaw-Irish gift exchange from 1847 to the present. So Padraig and Leanne, now it's over to you.
Thank you, Eamon. Thanks very much for that. Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. On behalf of myself and Leanne, we want to thank everybody at the University of Missouri, and we want to thank Eamon twice, essentially, not only once for being a contributor to Famine Pots and for helping us to tell that story, because of course it's a hugely collaborative work, but also for the invitation to tonight's event. So it is wonderful. So hello from me. I'll hand over to Leanne for a moment. We'll come back to the format for tonight then in just a second.
Thank you for inviting us, Eamon. It's a real pleasure to be here. Padraig and I really began this project six and a half, maybe 7 years ago, when I think back to our beginnings. And of course, all books take a while, but the germ of the idea really began in a meeting we had together. And it was in London. And I came over to visit, and I was coming actually from the Middle East. I had been in Jordan. So it's really a story of the journey. Our book is the story of the journey from the Irish and then the Choctaw, and our cultures coming together around the famine. And so it's still unfolding. We are still working on the stories of people that we met along the way and that we hope to meet in the future. So over to you, Padraig.
They're really good memories for me too. And I think, I mean, just to contextualize things, we're very conscious that some of you will have come across this story. I think the story is kind of very often referred to, and it's well known to a degree, but we're kind of conscious of the fact that some of you may be coming to it for the first time as well. So we want to frame it a little bit, as Leanne does some shameless promotion there, which is so very much appreciated. I remember that conversation well, and I suppose from my own perspective, I'm somebody who in the 1990s had begun to read Native American writing in Ireland. And as I worked through my PhD, which was mainly on Native American literature, I kind of became increasingly interested in work by wonderful writers like Leanne and so many others. And I contacted her in relation to Shell Shaker, which is the novel that Eamon mentioned at the beginning too. And we kind of begun to have conversations, and Leanne, being Leanne, was wonderfully generous and giving in that, and she answered every email, every small thing that I was tracing in the text. She was really happy to talk about. And for many years we kind of known each other. About 2 or 3 years before we began to work on Famine Pots, and she came over, as she says, from Jordan to give a guest lecture at Goldsmiths, where I teach. And we were having a cup of coffee, and at some point Leanne said to me, "So when are we going to do it?" And I said, "Do what exactly, Leanne?" She said, "The book. We need to do a book on the Choctaw and the Irish." And I think we have both known the story. I think many people who we speak to in both of our communities know the story. They know the reference. They know that the tribe sent money to the Irish. But I think it was Leanne's phrase, which I've been stealing ever since. I've been taking that. But she said we need to think about the deep ecology of that relationship. We need to think about what it really means. And in many ways, it's very interesting. I think we found this over time, that the gift itself is a wonderful, it's a sign of reciprocity, it's a sign of recognition, it's a moment of, in some ways, as Jackie Rand, one of our contributors, says, it's about also a kind of a reconciliation, perhaps, in terms of thinking about the wider histories between the Irish and Indigenous communities and so on. But ultimately, we wanted to think about what happened in the moment. So I think the detective work kind of started from there. So I might just say a few short things just on the context of the gift. Yes. Before I come back over to you, Leanne. So for those of you who are probably, most of you are familiar with the gift, I'm sure, but what we refer to as the gift is, of course, the money that is sent in 1847 from the tribe, from the Choctaw Nation, to the people of Ireland. The money is collected in Scullyville, which is in course, present-day Oklahoma, then known as Indian Territory. And Scullyville was an agency town. The people who gathered there, members of Choctaw Nation, along with some others, had heard about the famine in Ireland, which is often referred to as either the Great Famine or An Gorta Mór, if you want to use the Gaelic language. And they understood that there was a huge deal of hunger and death and destruction. So for those of you who I'm sure most people know the story of the famine, but the population in Ireland goes from being approximately 8 million to being 6 million in the space of 3 or 4 years, either through destitution and starvation or through immigration. So the money is collected. We think it's $710. We're following various historians, Annalise Hanson-Schrute, Mike Ward, they all use that number. It's sometimes reported as $170. We're not sure if that's a transcription error, but we think the 710 might be closer to the real amount. And that money was gathered and was sent very possibly with the Quakers Society Friends, also sent through the famine relief funds that were in New York and so on, and sent to the people of Ireland. And that kind of is the beginning of the story in some ways, and that is kind of the central aspect to it. So Leanne, if you want to maybe say a few words about the Choctaw sense of, and maybe some of the context that's around what happened for the nation prior to the gift, I suppose is probably really, really relevant.
Well, thank you for that. I like to hear this story even today. My mother, and I've written this, my mother's the person to tell me about the story of the gift. And she didn't put it that way. She said, the Choctaws sent money to the Irish during the famine. And we felt bad, and she went on to elaborate because she was making bread at the time when she's talking to me about this. And of course I didn't know anything about it, but she did. And she and her sisters were really tight about getting on the phone and staying all day on the phone with each other. They lived in two cities, McAllister and Oklahoma City. So I knew she'd been talking to them, and she just wanted to let me know. And so from there, I had always been very curious about how in the world did we know, what was going on in 1847 in Ireland. And the truth is that there was a lot known. When we began to do our research, there were notices in the Arkansas Intelligencer, and that they had posted news there, as well as the gift itself comes from, they were covering our meeting that year. And the Choctaws we are told, really were very heartbroken to hear that another culture was starving as our own people had starved in 1830, 1831, just walking themselves, some of them to death, to try to get into Indian territory, where we were removed by the government, the federal government. And that memory is seared into our brains as Choctaw people. We talk about that removal to this day, about the brutality, the people that died. We remember them. And so to have another event put before us of people who, as far as we knew, had never done anything, and have them starve as well, was just too much. And that's the way I kind of felt about it. But I think that's what my mother and her sisters felt like. Who are these people? And so that's really the beginning of what I think of as telling this story. And since then, of course, there has been so much written, and I am grateful that the story of our beginnings, and I'm talking about the Choctaw and the Irish, the story of our beginnings dovetailed together in this time period. And so to fast forward, so when Porig reached out to me in an email about the book Shell Shaker, I thought, oh my gosh, this is great. You know, this could be a moment where we could do an article or something about our communities together in standing in together in good relations. So that's what we did. And so it was very cool to come from the desert to a very green, beautiful place. Although it wasn't Ireland, it was to London, but still everything looked green to me. And so that's really the beginning. And we began to talk about this over a cup of coffee, or cup of tea for you, cup of coffee for me. And it just seemed like it just seemed like the right thing to do. I don't know. How did you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, interesting that I've spoken about this before. You know, for me, I suppose for you to mention the fact that we could possibly do this was itself a gift and an invitation, and that felt very right for me, because in some ways, and I think Eamon and I spoke about this a little bit in the past. I mean, in some ways, as an Irishman, you're thinking about obviously the points of connection. We can talk about some of those as we go through, and we think about those moments of cultural affinity. We think about, you know, similarities that we see in Ireland, you know, small nation, people who look outward, and an island nation, and think about the relationships with others. I think in many ways in which I've definitely found through conversations with you, you're thinking the Choctaw do and other Indigenous communities do. But for me, to rush straight into that story or think about that story in the first instance didn't feel comfortable or right, because in some ways it is the Choctaw gift. It's your story. And as somebody who worked within the field of Indigenous studies and thinking about Native American writing, I suppose I had a kind of a reservation myself in terms of maybe thinking through those things without necessarily doing it in a collaborative way. So just to write that story on my own would never have been possible, never been right. And as it happened through your invitation and thinking, it blossomed. And I think we're also, for you too, I mean, I don't by any means put words in your mouth, but I think the fact that this is a collaborative effort too, the fact that this is an edited collection, was also something that both you and I as editors were very much invested in and very interested in.
And so I feel the same way. I would not have attempted this book on the famine by myself. Why? Because it felt, and we were right about that. It felt like it needed to be a collaboration. And so, and editorially, that's the way we approached this book, and it will approach the next book. To have all of these touch points, both by Choctaw scholars and by Irish scholars, just seemed, yes, that's the right way to go. And I'm happy to say that for the most part, all of our scholars were very generous with their time, and so we have both voices that connect through this event, this big event. And it was a big event for us. We're not normally passing out money here and there because we didn't have it, but the bulk of Choctaws, as I understand it, felt like this must be done. Some people cried at the thought that someone else was suffering the way we had suffered, and that empathy pushed us forward. And today we have we've created this collaboration and conversation that is ongoing, and that is the greatest gift of all. I know I just spoke with Laura Clark, who's Muskogee Creek, and she is in Cork right now. She's the creeks are just down the road from us in Oklahoma, and so she is there doing story and also doing research. So this gift of exchange, because that's really what it was, and reciprocity continues until now. And then I suppose we should talk about the poetry in the book just a little bit. I had read a poem by Duran Negrifa that she had posted online about this gift giving and this event. And so I had written to her about doing a book of collaboration, and we did a small chapbook, and it's called Singing Still. But then when we got to the point we wanted some other kinds of voices, we asked her if she would be okay with putting her poem in poem every other chapter in the book, and she said yes. So that was another lucky happenstance. She's a remarkable poet, and we have remarkable stories that our colleagues wrote for this book, and I'm so enormously proud of the work that everybody has done.
Yeah, I really want to come back to that. I think the creative element and so on. But just something you said a second ago that you touched on that I want to think about for a moment. I think it's, and again, it's that important part of the story, the nation's experience in the 1830s, you know, during the removal moment. And of course, the international element of the aid, the charity that comes from across the Atlantic is itself so remarkable. And I think we both found that as we started writing on this, that collaborators and anybody who we tell the story to so excited by that possibility, the actual gift in and of itself, but also the fact that the nation, as you say, were very poorly placed to give this money, to show this type of generosity. I think it's Anneliese Hansen-Schrute who says that there was no population, no community less well positioned to act philanthropically at that moment. And I think, you know, for me, the resonances, I suppose, of means of empathy, of, I'd say, the recognition of others being in hardship, and kind of, in many ways, kind of reaching out to others seems to be such an important part of not only this story, but indeed Choctaw culture. And you've spoken about that in the past quite a bit, Leanne, this sense of giving and gifting and looking out for others. I mean, do you want to speak about that for a moment? I think that's a wonderful part of the story too.
Well,
I put you on the spot, haven't I? But yeah.
No, I was going to say, you know, what I learned came from my mother and uncles about Ima, giving. And so, for instance, there wasn't a Sunday that went by, I think, in which my mother and her sisters weren't cooking and giving things, and sometimes clothes. They were collecting and always giving. Anybody that they heard was in a hard time, they gave. Often a box full of food and also clothes. So this was just, I often thought, because, you know, of who I am, I often thought, gosh, do you really want to give that way? And my mother would say, hush, let's get this given to whoever is having a really bad time, and we can do this. So it was something she grew up with, something that my family grew up with, and something that I think I try to be as giving, and often fall short of making sure that people around us have what they need to live and survive. So, and I'll tell you this story real quickly. It's just a couple of sentences. So my grandfather lived way out in the country, and he didn't have running water or those kinds of things. He liked it. He's very happy. And mother would go once a week, less than that, probably once every 3 weeks and clean his house and so forth. And a snake skin was was right under his bed. A snake had shed its skin under his bed and then gone on its way. And mother said, my goodness, Dad, you have to be careful. There's a snake skin under your bed. What were you thinking? And he said, well, the snake lived there and I wasn't going to move him. And I thought at the time, oh my gosh, my relatives have gone over the bend. But he was just saying, they got along very well. He wasn't about to move the snake out until it was ready to go. And so these days, there's also Leslie Silko has the same attitude. She has snakes that have lived in her house, snakes that come and knock on the door. She has a pet snake that bangs on the door when he wants back in. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is across cultures. It's not just us. And there's a lesson to be had in that idea of giving shelter to the creatures around us. And it was a way of life. I'm far removed from that. But at the same time, I respect the way that my ancestors looked at life, the things they did, which led to collecting this money and giving it away to people they hadn't met.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so interesting to hear you talk about, say, the idea of charitableness and how that comes from the 19th century notion that we very often think of here, benevolence, and and we look at how famine gifting went, particularly during the years from 1846 to 49. And I think the most affecting examples where somebody helps is where somebody has experienced that kind of adversity themselves. And undoubtedly, I think not only is that why the Choctaw gift captures the imagination, but it's also why it's a really true reflection of just where that gift comes from, that type of gifting, I suppose, in some ways, where it comes from. And I think that's such an important part of it. You mentioned too, as I say, Darren's poetry, and even as you talk about your grandfather there and tell that story, I'm thinking too about the connections that we're seeing in some ways, culturally, spiritually, in terms of landscape traditions, and thinking about what resonates in both cultures. And I suppose for me, I often find myself kind of coming back to that idea of the Shanachie, how we tell stories in Ireland in a way where we think about connections. We think about how we're connected as communities. We're connected, I'll say, to specific places, specific stories, connected even to the ancestors and so on. And I suppose part of maybe in the second plans that we're making, I'm thinking about those points where Tim Tingle has already contributed a wonderful piece to the first book, but I'm thinking about Eddie Linehan and Sean Henry and other Irish voices, and how they tell stories too. And they're all very often in conversation in some ways with others as they tell stories. That seems to be really important in what you're saying there as well.
Yes, it's another point of connection, I think, and between our two cultures. I'm not saying it doesn't exist between, for other cultures, but this was something that was important. This was very important to us to help someone else in need. Now, we have a great history of that in the early 18th century when the Choctaws were dealing with the French. When they were their Cadillac, I believe, that may not be the right word. Anyway, their canoes had lost a lot of their food. The Choctaws sent food. We know this because the French wrote about it. We sent food and other supplies that would help them. Even though we didn't know them, we didn't speak the same language, but the French were amazed at the generosity coming out of that time in 1718. They got flooded out. Again, we sent food, and we're like, maybe you shouldn't put your town right here on the water, and so I think this is just part of the giving, ima, give culture, and there's a call and there's a response. And are you going to ignore this response? And the answer to that was no, not while we can do what we can do. And that is a lesson for us even today. If we look around at the state of things with the pandemic, we are trying to help people stay well, stay and doing the very best we can in our communities during this really difficult time of a worldwide, actually, pandemic. And so these are, to me, these are like circulating reciprocities that we have to pay attention to, and then learn to do a better job at keeping each other safe.
Yeah, yeah. I again, I've heard you speak about these things so often, but it's always wonderful to do so. And I think the idea, I suppose, of storytelling as a dynamic form, as a verbal art, and we think about the ways in which, for instance, Tim Tingle or Eddie Lenihan and others are looking, I suppose, they're connecting their audiences, really, aren't they, through folk traditions, and they're thinking about how we place modern audiences in contact with kind of historic events, with things that have gone before, personal and communal memories, and so on. And I suppose quite often we find that for both those men, Sean Henry and Tim Tingle, and the late Greg Rogers, of course, who's a great friend of yours and who I had the privilege to meet, very often they're thinking about times of adversity. So the Trail of Tears or the Great Famine, those moments in our collective kind of psyches within our communities where we face that kind of adversity. We have to confront it, but we also have to find how to find our way out of it. So as you say, and it's wonderful to think about that moment with the canoes and how that should resonate. Well, we don't normally put our canoes there. That's a story I'm giving you. It's not didactic or instructive, but it may be a hint, And I wonder, I wonder, first of all, are we losing some of that in the contemporary moment? And that's maybe a little anxiety I personally have, and I shouldn't voice that upon tonight's proceedings. But I wonder about this kind of forgetfulness, this kind of loss of memory by times. I mean, I was saying to Eamon earlier on that the Department of History, where I work, is like many humanities departments across the world at the moment under extraordinary pressure in terms of being seen as being somewhat unnecessary to what we do in the modern world. It's not quite producing what we think is the right output, as it were, and my own department as well. So I'm kind of wondering about the ways in which we tell stories. And I think it's Tim Tingle who says that we need to deal with loss, but we also need to keep a positive outcome. And storytelling is very much about that. It's about those kinds of means of continuance, I suppose, and resistance. Do you see that a lot in the work? Do you think, I feel like I'm asking you very direct questions now, but I'm wondering about that sense of the positivity. I know you've spoken about that before, but the positive aspect of this great gift, the joy, the celebration, the strength that it reflects and shows.
Well, we are nothing without our history, and I think as tribal people, as people who are tied to the land, if we lose that story, who are we? And that's what has always amazed me. If you don't have that perspective, if you don't have a story that you're tied to, what are you? Who are you? And I think it's not, I do think that's why we teach history. And I do think that's why we teach literary cultures and literature. We teach to learn about who we are and who we want to be, our highest selves. And I know that we here at Georgia, we are working hard to, as a community, to try to tell our story, so to speak, to our regions and remind them why we do this, because they, they often can't see the forest for the trees. I'm sorry to have to say that, but it's important that we remember these things, and it's what we do as teachers. And I never had a notion that I would be a teacher in my life. I've come to it, I guess, late. I never thought about teaching. I thought about being a writer, and I'm glad I can do both. But I've just found it to be a gift in and of itself that we give as faculty, that we've talked about that before, that this is something that we give to, our community of students and scholars. And it's vastly important in these times of pandemic. I've been talking a lot lately about the pandemics that were before us and what we're going to do in the future. And from pandemics, we know that we have famine.
Yeah.
So that's the outcome. So, I think there is one other thing I wanted to just say quickly, is when we were putting this book together, we had a lot of support from the Choctaws and Irish people who heard about it, sent us pictures of famine pots. We were, sometimes I was overwhelmed with the generosity that has been shown to us.
Yeah. It seems like a good moment to actually speak about that for a second, actually, because that's, of course, what we decided ultimately to take as our title, Famine Pots. And of course, many of you listening tonight or this afternoon in the US will be familiar with the fact that very often the charitable organizations, particularly the Quakers Society of Friends, would have had soup kitchens in Ireland. And, very often it would be these very large pots that simply were used to feed the community as they came to different sites. In some cases, lamentably, to workhouses. In other cases, just where a charity had set up. And of course, there's a controversial layer to these things too, because by times, whether these stories are apocryphal or not, but there are kind of stories about conversion, religious conversion, that maybe are tied to showing up at some of these sites and so on. But yeah, as you say, and this has been a wonderful part of it, and also kind of a very heavy, I suppose, memory. We see in some cases that some of the pots are very close to famine graveyards. I remember as a school child at home in Ireland, visiting the local famine graveyard in Rathdrum in County Wicklow, and so there's this kind of, on one hand, there's a sense of celebration that maybe endurance and this idea of feeding and charity and charitableness, but of course the other side, then the realities, the harsh realities of those times that are there.
Yeah.
Do you want to also, sorry, you were saying too, when we were doing the work, and it was such a fabulous idea to include some of the Choctaw implements and some of the Choctaw pots as well, and thinking, do you think that's in a way kind of related to and goes back to this idea of giving and celebration, I suppose, communal celebration through food and through feasting in certain ways?
Oh, that's been, I think, material culture items that people have and that they've shared with us. I mean, that also, that item, that thing, that noun, it has a story too, and it's trying to tell that story, or it's holding a story. So pots are such a great metaphor for holding stories, and that we're all part of it. And it's also about the sharing that went on. These pots are for sharing, and that's a gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, I love that idea of connectedness, I suppose, and thinking about that even as we share food and as we come together, and even very often how these pots are used and what's cooked and how things are mixed and so on.
Yeah.
I know you said before that stories have the power to transform, you know, histories and stories have the power to transform. I suppose that for me is one of the most exciting things, is kind of the transformative aspect of this research that we've been doing, the fact that it is incremental, the fact that we, as say, have come across so many stories as we continue on with the work, and all of those things have been fantastic. I think too, and I suppose I want to come back to that. You mentioned the poetry, and I suppose that call and response sense of things, and the collaborative nature of it. And I was just rereading, for those of you who maybe haven't had a chance to look at the book yet, but I was rereading some of Doireann's thoughts on this, and she was talking about a transatlantic conversation that's happening between yourself and herself, not only as poets but also as Choctaw and Irish women, and thinking also about a kind of a space where three languages are at play, thinking about the Choctaw language, thinking about the Irish language, and thinking about English, of course, as kind of the framing. And to me, that really talks to this nexus, if you like, this really important point of what we're doing, thinking about our experiences of colonialism and 19th century imperialism as well, and language loss, but also language continuance as it comes back to. That seems to me to be very much reflected in the title, you know, singing still, and that wonderful use of the comma. Do you want to speak about those things for a few moments yourself? I mean, this dialogue, this wonderful conversation that you've been having with Doireann and with other Irish artists as well, playwrights and Alex Pentek, sculptors and people like that.
That's right. So there's a real sense of dynamic conversation, because it is the monuments, it's the poetry, it's the words, it's song, it's our history texts that are in these books from both cultures that came together. I have seen her since she and I were invited to Montreal to give a reading. I think she was invited first, and then she said, well, I'd like to invite Leanne, so they invited me, because her poetry is so gorgeous. It's just stunning. So we did a collaborative reading, and we read from Singing Still, but we pulled things from Famine Pots as well that were centered around these two gift periods, and I was really moved she and I had this space in which it's just the two of us, and we're calling and responding to each other. And I have to say, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. It was very powerful, and I had no idea it would be that well received, but also just the power to shake a room. And so I enjoyed that very much, because it is a transnational story, and she and I connected through that story. And that's I don't know, that's kind of amazing, you know, for me, that it was the power of this story still resonates and moves people. So it was great. It was really one of those key moments that I will remember.
Yeah, no, you know, I think there is something electrifying to say about Doireann's contribution and what she does, and the way that, let's say, that kind of that communal voice that you have on some levels, the way that you quite literally finish each other's sentences, and it reminds me in lots of ways. I mean, when we think about Heaney's work, we think about some of the critical responses to it. Yeah, that sense of there's been a discussion about the storied and implotted landscapes that we find in poems like Bogland and so on. Yeah. And I think that's very much there. I mean, I'm kind of conscious of time. I know we've been going for 45 minutes, but I suppose I just wanted to ask you, we spoke a little bit about the current moment, and again, not wanting to bring some of these kind of darker clouds into the discussion, but I think the gift helps us to reflect on these things in certain ways. And I know, Eamon will probably laugh, or many Irish Americans will probably laugh when it is and it isn't, or kind of the Irish answer to many questions is very often both and. But I think that sense of searching out complication, of looking for things that are shifting, not looking for hard definitions, not looking to place particular impediments or borders upon either relationships or conversations. And thinking about your own work and Darren's, and also, let's say, Heaney's, and looking for the infinite, looking for, I think, what Heaney calls in Bogland, a sense of seepage, how, one thing will spread into another and so on. You've mentioned about the pandemic, and you've mentioned about our responses to it. And I note that at home in Ireland, the Docus charity have now found that 82% of Irish people, when questioned, say that the pandemic goes to prove how much we need each other internationally, how much we need to reach out to one another to help each other internationally. And I sit here in London reading those figures, thinking about, current politics here in this country post-Brexit, when we seem to be a kind of an island nation here in the UK again, in a way that it was not thought to have been for quite a while. And I'm kind of wondering about, I suppose, the story of what we're doing and the story of the Choctaw gift, how that resonates, how the Choctaw gift allows us to reflect perhaps on our need to help one another, to look for, very often in difficult circumstances, I say reconciliatory moments of strife and so on. I mean, many Irish Americans would have arrived in the 19th century. Not all of them were good actors. We know this to be the case. So, I mean, how do you see the gift now in our own moment? Do you think that this story in 2021 has particular purchase and resonance?
I do. And how is it that it does? It teaches us that we, again, must open our hearts and make this possible, that people can receive in our lifetime. People can be vaccinated, that people can be given this. I mean, we have our clinics all across the Southeast and in Oklahoma. We're giving the vaccine as much as we have, as much as we can. And that is true in Indian country, Oklahoma. And and we just will do it until we have no more. That's the lesson, because you're saving the future. You're always saving the future, whether it's by food, by vaccinations. And this is something we must do. It's not really even an option to say no. What has killed me, and I'll just leave it with that. What has really killed me or killed my soul is that a lot of people are saying, no, I don't want the vaccine. Nah. It just kills me to be so full of self worth that you believe you don't need something that is being offered to you as a gift. No, thanks. I'd rather be sick. And that's not what they're saying, but that is a lesson that I have found even among our own people that say, no, I don't. And we're doing better in terms of community in giving good reasons why you should do this. And of course, this is just among the young people, I think, that are very filled with, hubris. But we continue trying, right? We don't give up, and we continue on trying to make the point. This is very important. Don't be stupid. That's my response.
I think
Agree.
that's
Don't be stupid. So,
it's sagacious advice. I think it's good advice. I mean, it's so interesting to me to see, and again, Aim and I just beforehand were talking about this, to look at the vaccination rates in Ireland and in Indian countries, say, to look at, particularly amongst the Choctaw and other tribes. And I know talking to someone in Durant recently saying, yeah, we were almost at 90% before anywhere else, and the pride in that, the pride in terms of communally approaching something, collectively watching out for one another. And it's very interesting. I mean, I think in Ireland, because we are a small nation, we know one another. We understand that we rely upon one another. And in terms of how, kind of the parish pump politics, kind of how all those things work, I think we kind of tend to have a sense of who is doing things in the way that maybe they should be done, and who isn't, and so on. I think that's a really important part. I suppose, I say we'll hand back to Eamon in just a second, but to finish it on that really positive note too, don't be stupid, first of all, definitely. And second of all, I think many of you would have also come across the wonderful story during the pandemic of the GoFundMe page that was started
yes,
by one of the tribes, and we look at how the Irish response to that very often in their thousands, quite literally in their thousands,
yes,
celebrate the Choctaw gift. And it was a moment when the Irish decided that, yes, okay, here we can think about the Apache, we can think about a tribe who really need help right now, and we can make donations and send money. But nearly every one of those Irish people either name checked the Choctaw Nation directly or made reference to the fact that Indigenous communities had supported and helped Ireland at its greatest time of need. So in a way, you and your Choctaw Nation, you can clap yourself on the back and say, we've paid that forward by helping somebody else. It's come in this
somebody else,
amazing
right?
circle. Yeah, totally. Brilliant. Eamon, do you want to come back in, kind of conscious that perhaps you might have some questions yourself? The audience may have questions or things we haven't touched on just yet you might want to raise.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leanne, and thank you, Padraig, for filling us in on the book and on the project and the history of the famine and the connections that developed between the Choctaw Nation and Ireland, and that continue to the present, right? Through the pandemic with the Irish support of the GoFundMe page, and also I think with the scholarships that the Irish government has set up to bring Native American students to Ireland to study. And I think, we all believe in education, and of course, if you bring young people early into other cultures, they begin to learn and understand. And just like you do in your book, you tell the story, but the Native American students will come back from Ireland and tell the story of their experience there, and vice versa. Before I call for questions, I'm just going to read just for you from the first sentence of President Michael D. Higgins's word that begins the book, and I think it shows the sense of collaboration and community that the book fosters. So this is from President Michael D. Higgins of Ireland. During the year 1847, the people of Ireland were the beneficiaries of an extraordinary act of solidarity, generosity, and sympathy. It came in the form of a $172 donation to the Irish Famine Relief Fund from the Choctaw Nation, a Native American tribe living in the South Central United States. The Choctaw Nation had just 16 years earlier suffered their forced removal from Mississippi to what is now known as southern Oklahoma, a cruel and harrowing experience during which many, including a significant number of young children, died from disease, starvation, and extreme cold. So I think that the work, Leanne and Padraig, that you've done, is recognized by readers, but it's also recognized, I think, institutionally in Ireland and in the United States, by, as we can see from what President Michael D. Higgins wrote. The book, the Famine Pots, the Choctaw Nation gift exchange 1847 to the present, is available in the US through Michigan State University Press, and in Ireland and in Europe and probably the Commonwealth through Cork University Press. And it's a wonderful book, and it includes not only articles and material by Padraig and Leanne, but also historians like Christine Keneally and others, who are, very, very important storytellers of the potato famine. So I just wonder if there's anybody out there in the audience who would like to ask a question. Please do so. You can put it in the question and answer, the Q&A at the bottom, and where we will see it. So if you have a question, please do so. And of course, I can just start maybe. I was very, very much taken by Leanne's story of bread being baked and stories being passed down, right? And I think it's obviously, it seems to me in Ireland too, a lot of the things that we learn that are most important are taught to us while the person is doing something else, just passing off something, that you're not being sat down to be told a story. You're being passed on something that is completely natural and completely organic. Just as you should like bread, just as you should maybe be able to bake bread, you should also know the story. And of course, the stories and the histories are inseparable in a ways from food, right? And from the from the ordinary actions of people. And Padraig had brought up the idea of the Shanachie, and of course, it is the storytellers are mothers and fathers and relatives, right? And I often find these are teachers who are teaching while not teaching. They would never see themselves as teachers, but they would be passing on things in that way. So I thought that was Leanne, is a wonderful anecdote. And it is storytelling, Leanne, surviving and renewing itself in the Choctaw community, do you find?
Oh, yeah.
Despite technology and everything?
Oh, yes. I've been to Durant several times to come in and tell stories and sit. 4 or 5 years ago, I was invited to come in and speak to the women, and there were probably 200 women who had come, and we ended up telling a lot of stories. I mean, that just happens. They wanted to know about the work. They wanted to know about the book. They wanted to know about my mother's life and so forth. So in any setting, it boils down to, I think, it boils down to our families, our mothers, and we talk about our mothers and our aunts because we're a matrilineal society, and that just comes out. No one sits around and says, oh yeah, we have to tell stories about our mothers, but it happens. And there are great teachers, and so were our aunts. So that's the way it was. And I think that's the way it still is. So women get together. They have I think that they serve food every Monday or Wednesday. It'll be one of those dates, maybe it's Friday. And around those gatherings, because they're gatherings for women and children, there will be stories all the time. They're doing one thing and telling stories. So it's a wonderful way to get together. And and frankly, it's a wonderful teaching tool. All my classes, a lot of times when they're a bit staid, or if students are listless, I'll just bring in some food. Oh yeah, I learned. And that helps the conversation move along, even today.
It's really interesting, that, isn't it? This idea of the formality, I suppose, of what we all do as teachers or instructors. And the notion of the academic setting, this kind of, pseudo-intellectual prowess that you're supposed to show. But once you puncture that, once you, as you say, introduce a cup of coffee or talk about things a little more kind of openly, casually, suddenly stories begin to tumble out and people begin to think in different ways. And yeah, no, I mean, Eamon, what you're saying is so true. I mean, if I can, how many sentences I can think my own father beginning when he's talking to me about various things. And your mother, my mother used to say, my grandmother, his mother used to say, and one of her favorite phrases was, you should, I don't know if you've heard this one around in the Scorty, Eamon, but you should always take something out of your mouth and look at it twice before you say it, that kind of, and those little forms of kind of emotional intelligence or, kind of ways of looking at the world and thinking about things, they're really important. I think one thing that Leanne and I've spoken about too, and I think we were talking about this as well, but too, Eamon, the Irish funeral, I think, and also
Yes,
funerals in Choctaw culture. And I think the celebration of lives and telling stories about the dead and talking about people and having that kind of sense of the Irish wake, as it were. But from what you say, Leanne, too, there are very definitely elements in Choctaw culture, Indigenous cultures that kind of mesh with that.
right. Sitting with the dead and sitting up with the dead. That's one of the things my grandmother did and my aunts. Even in my lifetime, a person would be laid out at home, and people would come and tell stories and respect. That I remember myself, and it's pretty rare these days in Oklahoma culture. It's pretty rare, and probably because of sanitary or whatever, I don't know, that people are very concerned about things like that. But I definitely remember that, sitting up with the dead, and that was just something that's done. And the celebration of the life is the most important thing, and to tell stories, so.
Yeah. I think Eddie Lennon actually has said at some point, they're dead, but they're not dead.
They're not.
While I'm telling the stories, they're still alive. And
Yeah.
it's the same as it was before. So that sense of continuance, I suppose, and remembrance, memory, which is really important, as you're saying as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in Ireland, it's a community of the living and the dead. I mean, Joyce does it in the story The Dead, right? And but it's also very interesting, I think, in terms of healing, isn't it? That it allows people to grieve in public and not to be ashamed and to be supported. I mean, it's a very, and it's not just a person that's lost from a family, it's somebody from a community, and the community comes together in
Right.
wonderful ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
One other point I had too, I thought that one thing that I noticed when I came to the US first, it really occurred to me, when you go into a Native American household as a visitor, everything stops, just like in Ireland, because there's this wonderful sense of hospitality, and everything stops, and all work stops, and everybody talks, which I found very interesting. We haven't had any much questions or comments yet from the audience. So out there on some are on Facebook, some are on YouTube, others are in the webinar. So if you really have a question, if you want to put it into the Q&A or the chat, we will certainly answer it. In the meantime, you mentioned, both Leanne and Padraig mentioned another project. So could you tell us something about this? Now, I don't want to jinx the project by having you talk about it, but is there a follow-up to Famine Pots 2 in the works? Maybe you could, Leanne, you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, I see Porg laughing because yes, we are going to have we are not sold on the title yet, but we are doing another book. And in this book, we had talked about and focusing on the young people in both cultures, what was happening to them, how did they survive, and then what happened to them, where are they? So it's a book that engages with young people. And I know from Greg Rogers' story about the little girls, it was it was a very powerful story of young people. I've just written a new play with another Irish scholar, Calm Summers, and it's called The Keening. And so we focused on young people in both cultures. At the play takes place in Dokesville, and they're of course spirits. They've died from famine and hunger, both of them. So they're catapulting us back and forth through their stories, and it's set in Dokesville Cemetery. So we hope to get it up on its feet. I went to New York. He came out here to Georgia, and it's about these two little girls, and so what happened to them, and the coldness of governmental programs who created this terrible hunger in both cultures. So, but that's the work that Porg and I hope that we will be doing. We will be writing about and gathering stories from young people. Over to you.
I was only laughing at the idea of the big reveal on the internet, which we're now tied into, and I kind of, conscious of the date appearing in the bottom, date stamped somewhere. So we will know how long this one took, which for any academics out there is always a bit of a joke in the way. Everything takes ages, but yeah, I think that is. I mean, you summed it up beautifully, Jan. So I won't try and recreate the wheel there, but. Also, we kind of spoken about, and following on from what you were suggesting there, Eamon, a moment ago, is we spoke about also how we remember in both cultures, and the idea of funerals as well, and perhaps the idea of living with spirits and having spirits as part of our realities to a degree. And anyone who's familiar with Leanne's work at all will be very familiar with tribalography in that sense of bringing kind of collective stories to bear and having those with you as you write and do different kinds of work, which I think also is a really big part of the next project, different kinds of work. So as Leanna said, she's working creatively, and we think about kind of the representations in various kind of visual cultures and so on of the famine. We also think about the detective work that we do as researchers, and I think we're both interested in not so much capturing, but sharing and reflecting stories that we hear in both communities about this particular gift, and to revisit those. So yes, I think we're well and truly tied in. We've made it real on live TV, as it were. We're doing this, so we're locked and loaded. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, once we're finished in a day or two, this event will be on YouTube. So you'll be we can hold you to your word. I think one thing that you do that in this book too that's very interesting is that I think both Native peoples in the US and Irish people have been subject to various stereotyping over the centuries, and have been portrayed in all kinds of ways. To say insensitively would be an understatement, and I think that one of the really interesting aspects of this book is in telling the story, you bring different portraits and different worlds to light, and I think and that is it's a very great part of the book's achievement. And I think, of course, with the next volume, then, if you bring in the stories of younger people, we are looking at the past, the present, and also the future. So I think it is really it will be really very very welcome. So I think maybe we will leave it there. And so I just end by just again recommending the book to you, Famine Pots, the Choctaw-Irish Gift Exchange, 1847 to the present, published by Michigan State University Press and by Cork University Press. I want to congratulate Leanne, Howe, and Padraig Kerman on the success of the book. I mean, it's been reviewed and written about everywhere it seems, and to send them forward, with best wishes for the next volume. But also on behalf of our audience today and everybody at UMSL Global, to thank you for giving up your time. It's evening in London, afternoon in Georgia, and for coming along with us to share this story with us, and to remind us of all these important parts of our shared history of the Irish and the Choctaw Nation. So thank you both to our audience and to Padraig and Leanne very much. And good luck to everybody. And we hope to see you soon at another of our Irish programs here at UMSL Global. Good luck and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So the
Great.
okay, all right. So the recording is